This is a time of year when much of the African community and various liberal institutions, including some associated with the United States government, will be celebrating the anniversary of the January 15th birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It is easier for most of them to celebrate the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. than it is to memorialize his death. Since his April 4th, 1968 assassination that led to serious uprising throughout the African domestic colony of the United States and the United States Capitol that resulted in the deployment of US military forces, including armored assault vehicles. The legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been stripped of its revolutionary political content and relegated to a harmless caricature with no relationship to the period of intense anti-colonial struggle that he so eloquently represented. The US government that spied on and harassed him, attempting to provoke his suicide, has established his birthday as a holiday to inspire African people to a day of service that will substitute sweeping our community streets of litter for sweeping the world of the colonial oppression that King represented with an unequal passion and courage. We too of the Uhuru Movement call on our friends and supporters to join us in celebrating the birth of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in relentless and perpetual service to the people in the fashion of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King was not dropped into some pristine historical moment that characterized unclean streets and the like, being promoted by those who claim fidelity to his legacy. He was born as an African man who, like all of us, was battered by various iterations of colonialism, including the remnants of enslavement that robbed us of a capacity for self-determination. This violent deprival of self-determination by an alien and foreign power is known as colonialism. And King's political activity was generated by efforts to overturn the oppression and exploitation that has always characterized colonialism worldwide and within the United States. While there have always been popular expressions of anti-colonial resistance, and while Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the most eloquent representatives of this resistance, the essential nature of colonialism that inspires resistance globally is colonialism's capture and control of the productive forces of a people. This means control of the land, instruments of production, and the people who would use the instruments and their labor to produce on the land. It is this recognition that has led to the conclusion by the Uhuru Movement that the political and economic are one, that ultimately all politics, including the anti-colonial politics of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is concentrated economics. We will best understand the politics of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by remembering the period within which he was politically active, a period with glaring similarities to this period within which we now exist and struggle. It was a time of global upheaval that resulted from the ubiquitous struggles of colonized peoples. It was a period born of struggle in the 1950s that included the 1955 Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott that thrust King into prominence. However, the Montgomery movement that became a hallmark of Black struggle within the United States was preceded by the Bandung Conference in April 1955, where representatives of 29 governments of Asia and Africa convened in Bandung, Indonesia, around the core principles of self-determination, non-interference in internal affairs, sovereignty, equality, and an end to racial discrimination wherever it occurred. In 1959, Cuba was liberated from the clutches of colonialism that functioned under the purview of the United States. In March 1960s, the US supported settler colonial apartheid government of South Africa gunned down scores of unarmed demonstrators in Sharpeville for demanding the right to travel in our own country without showing identification passes to the authorities. And on January 17, 1961, the US, working with Belgium, France, and the United Nations, participated in the brutal murder of Patrice Lumumba, who had led the Congo to freedom from direct Belgium colonial control. I'm reciting all these events to show that the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not an isolated event that happened in a pristine political environment except for US Southern segregation or a desire for domestically colonized African people for social integration with our colonial oppressors. King lived and died during a whirlwind of profound social, political, and economic upheaval inspired by the struggles of Africans and others to overturn a globalized colonial mode of production. It was upheaval that brought the great powers of the United States and Russia in particular to the brink of nuclear Armageddon during what was characterized as the Cold War, except it was not a Cold War. In the colonial territories of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Memphis, Tennessee, USA. The so-called Cold War that claimed the lives of thousands of Vietnamese, killed Patrice Lumumba in Congo, overthrew Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, killed more than 1 million people in Indonesia, and Arab militants in occupied Palestine, etc., ad infinitum. Also killed Malcolm X, Black Panther Party militant Bobby Hutton, framed, arrested, and tried 21 members of the Black Panther Party, and assassinated Fred Hampton. It also killed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as part of a viciously violent counterinsurgent process to protect a colonial status quo that requires unending murder, displacement, starvation, and the highest levels of undemocratic practices, ruled without regard for law for its success. It was characterized as Cold War because the two defined main protagonists, US and the Soviet Union or Soviet Russia, did not engage in direct military confrontation, which could have led to nuclear annihilation of both and the possible destruction of life on Earth. It was an indirect struggle for the resources of the world, human and material, concentrated in territories held under European colonial domination within a parasitic global colonial mode of production. Highlights of the politically turbulent period that we must understand included the November 1963 assassination of US President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's anti-colonial Black Power Declaration in Greenwood, Mississippi, on June 16, 1966, that had been preceded by the January 1966 anti-colonial trilateral conference in Havana, Cuba, attended by 500 delegates from 82 countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. On November 1st, 1963, US installed Vietnam President Diem was overthrown and killed in a coup that removed this recalcitrant neo-colonial puppet. The November 22nd, 1963 assassination of US President John Fitzgerald Kennedy is what led to Malcolm X's statement describing his assassination as a matter of the chickens coming home to roost. On June 16, 1966, the Black Power Declaration by SNCC in Greenwood, Mississippi affirmed the anti-colonial character of the struggle of African people in the United States and gave it a general unity with the anti-colonial movements happening throughout the world. The first Black Power direct action within the United States would happen in St. Petersburg, Florida, when SNCC organizers marched into City Hall and tore from the wall a vicious, dehumanizing 7 by 10-foot mural caricaturizing African people as ape-like musicians entertaining colonial whites at a beach. This happened on December 29, 1966. It was an action that on May 2nd, 1967, would be followed by 24 armed members of the newly formed Black Panther Party for Self-Defense marching into the California State Assembly in a demonstration protesting planned legislation that would change the gun laws, making it illegal for the colonized to possess weapons for self-defense in the face of the intense violence being visited upon our people by the colonial state and individual whites acting as the state in reinforcing our oppression. The African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru Movement were critical participants of the anti-colonial struggles of our people in the 1960s for happiness and a return of our stolen human and material resources. The founding of the African People's Socialist Party in May of 1972 was organized with the stated objective of completing the Black Revolution of the 60s that resulted in the counterinsurgency that killed King and others who championed our liberation. A document establishing the US government's FBI-initiated campaign was known as COINTELPRO, an acronym for Counterinsurgency Program. This is an excerpt that laid out its goals, quote, for maximum effectiveness of the counterintelligence program and to prevent wasted effort, long-range goals are being set. Number one, prevent the coalition of militant Black nationalist groups. In unity, their strength, a truism that is no less valid for all its triteness. Number two, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Number three, prevent violence on the part of Black nationalist groups. This is of primary importance and of course a goal of our investigative activity. It should also be a goal of the counterintelligence program to pinpoint potential troublemakers and to neutralize them before they exercise their potential for violence. Number four, prevent militant Black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them to three separate segments of the community. The goal of discrediting Black nationalists must be handled tactically in three ways. You must discredit those groups and individuals to first, the responsible Negro community. Secondly, they must be discredited to the white community, both the responsible community and to liberals who have vestiges of sympathy for militant Black nationalists simply because they are Negroes. Third, these groups must be discredited in the eyes of Negro radicals, the followers of the movement. This last area requires entirely different tactics from the first two. Publicity about violent tendencies and radical statements merely enhances Black nationalists to the last group. It adds respectability in a different way. And number five, a final goal should be to prevent the long-range growth of militant Black organizations, especially among youth. Specific tactics to prevent these groups from converting young people must be developed, unquote. So the founding of the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru Movement is the only thing that has prevented the success of the government to destroy our struggle to complete the work of King and other anti-colonial champions. This is the meaning of our Black Power blueprint and the more than 50 independent economic and political projects of the Uhuru Movement. It is also the explanation of why the FBI attacked our party and movement on July 29 to frustrate the ability of our people to recapture the productive forces and the independent ability for creation of life and happiness. The brutal attack on our anti-colonial movement that killed King and others during the 1960s happened under a cloak of governmental secrecy that limited our ability to defend the movement of our people for happiness and a fruitful material life. This was an obvious disadvantage that hampered our ability to organize and win allies, to unite with our just struggle for happiness and return the resources stolen from us. Now the world knows that on July 29, 2022, it was the US government's secret political police called the FBI that attacked us. Now you know. And with this knowledge, you are armed to take a righteous stance to support our movement, to support your movement, the Black Power blueprint, and all the anti-colonial programs that contribute to a world of free people that rejects the relics of the past requiring slaves and slave masters and exploiters and the exploited. Now you know and can live like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and complete the struggle for liberation and freedom that he died struggling to achieve. Live like Dr. Martin Luther King. Remember Dr. Martin Luther King as part of the incredible struggle of our people and other peoples around the world to destroy a colonial mode of production that's based on parasitism, the ongoing theft of the life and resources of the oppressed peoples of the world. Uhuru.